The sun was setting slowly behind the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. Residents of the small Virginia town began turning on the lights in their homes, while local businesses closed their doors. Another peaceful day was coming to an end, accompanied by the distant sound of waterfalls and the cool breeze descending from the mountains. In the central square, old Mr. Jack Wilson, a white-haired gentleman with skin marked by time, sat on his usual bench. His tired eyes observed the children still playing, running around the gazebo. "The legends of this land are more real than most people imagine," he commented to no one in particular, though his voice reached the ears of Mrs. Ellen Davis, who was passing by. "Talking about the Mountain Guardian again, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, adjusting her shopping bag on her arm. "My late husband also believed in those stories." "They're not just stories, Mrs. Davis. They're warnings. The Guardian protects those who are chosen, but also keeps away those who don't respect this land." Mrs. Davis smiled kindly. At 65, she had learned to respect local traditions, even if she didn't believe in all of them. Her thoughts turned to her daughter, Sarah, and her son-in-law, Michael, who had gone for a weekend in the mountains with little Noah, her only grandchild. Meanwhile, miles away, in an isolated cabin in the mountains, Sarah and Michael were enjoying their last moments of peace before returning to town. Noah slept peacefully in his makeshift crib, oblivious to the adults' concerns. "It's getting dark quickly, Sarah," Michael commented, looking out the window. "I think we should wait until tomorrow to head back. The clouds look heavy." Sarah sighed, running her hand through her black hair. Her brown eyes reflected worry. "I can't, Michael. I have a shift at the hospital early tomorrow. I promised Dr. Matthews I wouldn't miss again." "Is one shift worth more than our safety?" he questioned, unable to hide the irritation in his voice. "It's not about worth. There are children who depend on me. You know how difficult it is to find pediatricians willing to work in rural areas." The discussion was interrupted by a distant thunderclap. The sky, previously orange, now displayed dark gray tones. Michael looked out the window again and saw the first raindrops hitting the glass. "All right," he conceded, starting to pack their bags. "But let's take it slow. The mountain road is dangerous even in good weather." Half an hour later, they were in the car. Noah, secured in his car seat in the back, played with a small cloth mobile. The rain, previously timid, now fell intensely. The windshield wipers could barely keep up with the downpour. In the town center, Richard Hammond disembarked from his private helicopter, ignoring the gathering storm. Tall, athletic, with an intense gaze, he exuded power and determination. He was greeted by his assistant, Diane, who waited with an umbrella. "Are the documents for the land purchase ready?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, sir. But there's still resistance. Some families don't want to sell their properties, and there's a protected area that—" "Resistance is merely a temporary obstacle, Diane. Everything has its price." They entered a black SUV that awaited them. As the driver navigated the narrow town streets, Richard observed through the window, imagining how he would transform this quiet place into a luxury resort. His grandfather had failed decades ago, but he wouldn't make the same mistakes. On the mountain road, Sarah and Michael's situation worsened with each minute. The rain now fell in dense sheets, and the wind violently shook the trees along the roadside. A particularly loud thunderclap frightened Noah, who began to cry. "Shh, it's okay, sweetheart," Sarah tried to calm him, turning back. It was at that moment that everything changed. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing a huge fallen tree blocking the path. Michael braked sharply, but the wet asphalt betrayed the vehicle's control. The car skidded, spun, and before they could process what was happening, plunged over the cliff. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain. Sarah and Michael, unconscious, remained trapped by their seatbelts. In the back seat, Noah cried, frightened and confused. The smell of fuel began to spread through the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and vegetation. That's when it appeared. A black horse of majestic stature emerged from among the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. With determined steps, it approached the crashed vehicle. It sniffed the air, sensing the imminent danger. The black horse circled the wrecked car carefully, its hooves sinking into the mud forming under the relentless storm. Its eyes, a deep, almost supernatural brown, fixed on little Noah, who now hiccuped, exhausted from crying. The animal whinnied softly as if trying to reassure the child. With precise movement, the mountain guardian used its strength to push against the rear door already damaged by the impact. The metal creaked and gave way, allowing rain to enter the vehicle. Noah stopped crying. For a moment, his curious little eyes fixed on the imposing figure before him. In a surprising gesture, the small child stretched his trembling fingers toward the animal's muzzle. The horse, hesitant at first, approached and allowed the touch. It was as if an invisible electric current passed between them in that moment, sealing an ancestral pact that transcended human understanding. The smell of fuel was growing stronger by the second. Small sparks were beginning to appear in the front of the vehicle, foreshadowing an even greater disaster. With a gentleness that contrasted with its powerful build, the Guardian used its teeth to pull at the straps of Noah's car seat, yanking it from the wreckage with a single, firm movement. Holding the baby by the car seat, the horse quickly moved away, entering the dense forest moments before an explosion illuminated the stormy night, the flash reflecting in the raindrops like thousands of tiny, incandescent diamonds. Town Mrs. Ellen Davis woke with a start, her heart beating rapidly. She sat up in bed, breathing heavily, and reached for the glass of water on her nightstand. She'd had a vivid dream, so real it seemed more like a vision, a black horse carrying her grandson into the mountains while flames danced in the background. "Noah," she whispered, a knot forming in her throat. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, she got up and went to an old dark wooden dresser that had belonged to her late husband. She opened the bottom drawer, and among yellow documents and old photographs, found something she hadn't seen in years, a small iron amulet, crafted in the shape of a horse in running position. "This can't be coincidence," she murmured to herself, clutching the amulet between her wrinkled fingers. At that same hour, Rachel Martinez, head of the Forest Rangers, received an emergency call. A rescue team had been dispatched to an accident on the mountain road. She quickly put on her uniform, grabbed her equipment, and headed out into the rainy night. When she arrived at the scene, several vehicles were already positioned, and paramedics were working hard to extract Sarah and Michael from the smoking remains of the vehicle. Rachel approached one of the rescuers. "How are they?" "Alive, incredibly. He has some fractures, and she has a concussion, but they'll survive." "And the child? They said there was a baby in the car." The rescuer frowned, his expression heavy with concern. "We didn't find any baby. The car seat was ripped from the back seat. We're starting to search the area, but with this rain and darkness..." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She knew these mountains like the back of her hand and was aware of the dangers lurking in the dense forest. A baby alone wouldn't survive for long. "I'll mobilize my team immediately," she said, already activating her radio. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the mountain guardian advanced carefully, protecting Noah from the rain with its own body. The baby, surprisingly calm, observed the path with attentive eyes, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. After a long journey, they reached a protected area among rock formations where the rain couldn't reach. The horse gently placed the car seat on the dry ground. Other wild horses emerged from the shadows, approaching cautiously, sniffing the air around the small human intruder. The guardian whinnied, as if giving instructions to the herd, and the others retreated, maintaining a respectful distance. The next morning, news of the accident and Noah's disappearance spread quickly through Blue Ridge. Volunteers gathered in the central square to help with the search. When Mr. Jack Wilson heard about the incident, he immediately sought out Mrs. Ellen Davis. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked without preamble. Mrs. Davis nodded, showing him the iron amulet. "I found this last night. I never understood why my husband guarded it so zealously." "This amulet belonged to an ancient lineage of mountain protectors," explained Jack Wilson, touching the object with reverence. "People chosen to keep alive the memory of the guardian and protect the secrets of the mountain." "Are you saying my husband was one of them?" "Yes. and now your grandson has been chosen by the Guardian itself. At the town hospital, Sarah was slowly regaining consciousness. The daylight hurt her eyes as reality returned in confused flashes. Michael was in a bed next to her, still unconscious, with various machines monitoring his vital signs. Noah was the first word that escaped her dry lips. Where is my son? The nurse adjusting the IV exchanged a worried look with the doctor who had just entered the room. Sarah, I'm Dr. Thompson. You've been in a serious accident. You need to rest. My son, she insisted, trying to sit up. Please, where is Noah? The doctor gently held her hand. Search teams are scouring the entire area. We'll find him, I promise. On the other side of town, Richard Hammond received news of the accident with unusual interest. A missing baby and reports of a black horse in the area, he asked his assistant. This reminds me of the stories my grandfather used to tell. You don't really believe those legends, do you? Questioned Diane, incredulous. Richard smiled enigmatically as he looked out the hotel window, observing the mountains shrouded in mist. My grandfather wasn't a man with a fertile imagination, Diane. If he said he saw the mountain guardian, then the animal exists. And now finally I have the chance to prove it. 3 days had passed since the accident. The town of Blue Ridge lived in an atmosphere of mixed tension and hope. Posters with little Noah's photo were spread throughout every corner, and search teams tirelessly combed the rugged mountain region. At the hospital, Sarah was discharged against Dr. Thompson's recommendations. Michael, with multiple fractures, would remain hospitalized longer. The couple said goodbye with a kiss full of emotion and silent promises. I'll find him, Michael, Sarah whispered, holding her husband's hand. I know he's alive. I can feel. Jose, be careful, he pleaded, his voice weak from the medication. I can't lose you too. Leaving the hospital, Sarah found Rachel Martinez waiting for her. The forest ranger, in her impeccable uniform and determined expression, handed her a bottle of water. I thought you might want to join the search, said Rachel. No one knows your son better than you. Sarah nodded, grateful for the understanding. The two women headed to Rachel's car, preparing for another day of exhaustive searching. In the town center, Mr. Jack Wilson and Mrs. Ellen Davis sat on her porch, talking in hushed voices. The iron amulet rested on the table between them, softly, gleaming in the morning sunlight. You need to tell your daughter the truth, insisted Jack Wilson. She has the right to know about her husband, about the family's connection to the Guardian. Mrs. Davis sighed deeply, her tired eyes fixed on the distant mountains. How do I explain something I don't fully understand myself? Thomas was never very clear about this story. He talked about the Guardian, about the amulet, but always as if they were fragments of a larger puzzle. Your husband was protecting you, explained the old man. The less you knew, the less danger you'd be in. But now with the Guardian choosing Noah, things have changed. Before Mrs. Davis could respond, they heard the sound of a car parking. Through the window they saw Sarah getting out of Rachel's vehicle. The two women hurried to greet her. In the heart of the forest, in a canyon hidden among ancient rock formations, Noah was safe under the unexpected care of the Guardian and its herd. The baby played with fallen leaves, closely watched by the wild horses that took turns protecting him. In the center of the canyon, a large white stone glistened under the sunlight filtered through the treetops. The Guardian always remained close, as if sharing a special bond with the child. When Noah cried from hunger, the black horse guided other members of the herd to bring wild fruits that naturally fell from the trees. Fresh water from a nearby stream was offered in large leaves, transformed into small natural containers. The communion between the child and the animals seemed to transcend common logic. Noah, despite his tender age, demonstrated a surprising understanding, as if an ancient wisdom had awakened within him. In town, Richard Hammond was recruiting men for a private expedition. In his hotel room, maps of the region covered the bed and part of the floor. Diane observed with growing concern. Are you really prioritizing this search for a legendary horse over the resort project? She questioned. Richard didn't raise his eyes from the map he was studying. This isn't just a whim, Diane. It's a family reckoning. My grandfather dedicated his life to proving the Guardian's existence, and everyone thought he was crazy. He disappeared in these mountains pursuing this animal. And if it's just a coincidence? A common wild horse that was in the right place at the right time? Richard finally looked at his assistant, a strange gleam in his eyes. Then why would the animal specifically take the baby? Why not attack like any wild animal would? No, there's something more happening here, something that has to do with local legends. At Mrs. Davis's house, Sarah listened incredulously to the stories her mother and Mr. Jack Wilson shared. The iron amulet rested in her palm, strangely warm to the touch. "You're telling me my father was part of a lineage of human guardians, and that now my son has been chosen by a mystical horse?" she asked, her voice trembling between disbelief and desperate hope. "I know it sounds crazy," admitted Mrs. Davis, "but your father believed it with complete conviction. On the night of the accident, I had a dream, a vision as clear as I'm seeing you now. Noah was with the Guardian, protected." Rachel, who had been listening to the conversation in silence, finally spoke up. "Listen, I respect local traditions, but we can't base our search on legends. We need facts, concrete clues." Mr. Jack Wilson smiled patiently. "Sometimes, young lady, the facts are right before our eyes, but we can't see them because we're looking for the wrong answers." The old countryman turned to Sarah, his penetrating gaze fixed on her eyes. "Have you been dreaming about your son since the accident? Seen things you can't explain?" Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. How could he know? In recent nights, fragmented images had invaded her dreams, horses galloping under moonlight, a gleaming white stone, and Noah, always smiling, as if wanting to say he was okay. "Yes," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I saw horses, many of them, and a large white stone glowing." Jack Wilson's wrinkled face lit up. "The Oracle Stone, that's where the Guardian takes the chosen ones." Rachel frowned. "What stone is that? I know every inch of these mountains, and I've never heard of it." "Because it's not a place you find with maps and compasses, young lady," replied the old man. "It's a place that reveals itself only to those who are called." At that moment, the amulet in Sarah's hand seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. She looked at the small metal object, fascinated. "It's trying to show us the way," said Jack Wilson, observing the phenomenon. "The amulet and the Guardian are connected. One responds to the other." Outside, the sky was beginning to darken, heavy clouds gathering again over the mountains. A storm was approaching, but different from the previous one. This one seemed to carry a purpose, a message. In the forest, the wild horses grew restless. The Guardian raised its head, sniffing the air. Noah, sitting near the great white stone, also looked to the sky, as if understanding what was about to happen. The decisive moment was approaching, and all paths were converging toward the heart of the mountains, where ancient secrets waited to be revealed and intertwined destinies would finally be confronted. The storm approaching Blue Ridge was not ordinary. Lightning danced among the dark clouds without making noise, as if the sky itself was whispering ancient secrets. The town's animals displayed unusual behavior. Dogs howled at nothing, birds flew in confused circles, and horses on neighboring farms reared and whinnied for no apparent reason. Sarah observed the sky through her mother's house window, the iron amulet clutched in her hand. Each time a silent lightning bolt cut across the sky, the small metal object seemed to vibrate in synchrony. "It's as if they're conversing," she whispered, more to herself than to others present. Mrs. Davis approached her daughter, placing a cup of chamomile tea on the table beside her. "Your father used to say that storms in the mountains were never just natural phenomena," she commented. "He said they were moments when the veil between worlds grew thinner." Rachel, who was analyzing topographical maps of the region spread across the kitchen table, raised her eyes with a skeptical expression. "With all due respect to local traditions, we need a concrete plan. If this oracle stone exists, it must be somewhere physical in these mountains." Mr. Jack Wilson smiled patiently as he lit his pipe. "The city girl still doesn't understand," he murmured to Mrs. Davis, who nodded discreetly. The old man turned to Rachel. Have you ever wondered why they never found Mr. Hammond's grandfather? Or why some experienced hikers simply disappear in these mountains and reappear days later with no memory of what happened? The mountains have their own paths, young lady, paths that only open for those they choose. Rachel's radio crackled, interrupting the conversation. It was one of the forest rangers reporting that they had found horse tracks near the accident site, but the trail mysteriously disappeared after a few hundred yards. We've hit a dead end, admitted Rachel, frustrated. 4 days of intensive searching, and not a sign of the baby. It was then that Sarah felt something strange. The amulet in her hand suddenly grew hot, almost burning her skin. At the same time, a crystal-clear image formed in her mind. Noah, sitting near the great white stone, surrounded by wild horses, smiling as if he were at home. He's okay, she said, her eyes welling up. I can see him now, more clearly than ever. At the same moment, in his hotel room, Richard Hammond felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were calling to him. His hands trembled as he tried to control his breathing. Diane, alarmed by her boss's sudden pallor, ran to call for help. No, he ordered, raising his hand. I'm fine. It's just a memory. Richard walked to his suitcase and removed a small object, wrapped in a black silk handkerchief. As he unwrapped it, he revealed a metal fragment similar to the amulet Sarah possessed, but broken and worn by time. My grandfather left this for me, he explained, noticing the curiosity in Diane's gaze. He said it was part of something larger, something that could reveal the mountain's greatest treasure. In the hospital, Michael woke from a restless sleep, calling for Noah. The nurse on duty tried to calm him, but he insisted on speaking with his wife. I need to tell her, he murmured, agitated, about the dream, about what I saw. In the forest, the mountain guardian remained alert. The other horses in the herd formed a protective circle around Noah and the oracle stone. The smooth white surface of the enormous rock was beginning to emit a soft, pulsating glow, as if responding to the forming storm. Noah, surprisingly calm for a baby in such unusual circumstances, touched the stone with his small hands, and each touch seemed to intensify the glow. The guardian watched attentively, its eyes reflecting the luminous spectrum emanating from the rock. Back at Mrs. Davis's house, the amulet that Sarah held began to emit the same pulsating glow. All those present watched the phenomenon, fascinated. It's time, announced Jack Wilson, rising with surprising agility for his age. The mountain is communicating. What should we do? Asked Mrs. Davis, her voice trembling. Follow the call, replied the old man. Sarah, you need to take the amulet where it wants to go. Rachel, though still skeptical, couldn't deny what she saw. The metal object in Sarah's hand definitely emitted its own light, something that defied rational explanation. I'll go with you, she decided, grabbing her equipment. Whatever we're looking for, it's better to be prepared. In his hotel, Richard was also preparing. Carrying the fragment of the amulet, and accompanied by 3 hired men, ex-military with tracking and combat experience, he headed for the garage, where a truck awaited them. Are you sure about this? Asked Diane, concerned. This storm doesn't seem natural. Nothing in this town is natural, Diane, he replied with a somber smile. Night was falling over Blue Ridge when 2 distinct groups began their journey toward the heart of the mountain. On one side, Sarah, guided by the luminous amulet, accompanied by her mother, Jack Wilson, and the reluctant forest ranger, Rachel. On the other, Richard Hammond and his men, following the call of the broken fragment he carried. The unusual storm continued to form, the sky transforming into a kaleidoscope of grey and bluish tones, the silent lightning becoming more frequent. Despite the growing darkness, neither group considered postponing the search. There was an urgency in the air, as if the mountain itself was calling. Are we really doing this? Asked Rachel, as she drove her jeep along a dirt road that wound through the dense trees, following a glowing piece of metal up the mountain during a storm. Do you have a better idea for finding my son? Retorted Sarah, without taking her eyes off the amulet that now emitted a constant pulsating glow. Jack Wilson, seated in the back seat next to Mrs. Davis, smiled with satisfaction. The mountain chooses its moments, miss, And it also chooses who can enter its secrets. Rachel sighed, resigned, and continued driving. As an experienced forest ranger, she knew every official trail in these mountains, but as they advanced, she realized they were being led down paths that weren't on any map. Meanwhile, in Richard's truck, the atmosphere was tense. The three hired men exchanged uneasy glances as they penetrated deeper into the forest, following the indications of the amulet fragment, which, like Sarah's, glowed inexplicably. "Boss, are you sure you know where we're going?" asked one of them, a hard-featured man named Vince. "This area isn't on any map we studied." "That's exactly why we're here," replied Richard, with a conviction that didn't allow for questioning. "My grandfather spent his entire life looking for this place." At the hospital, Michael had convinced the nurse to make a call to Mrs. Davis's house. Upon discovering that everyone had gone out in search of Noah, he felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Still weak but determined, he called a doctor. "Doctor, I need to get out of here," he said, trying to sit up in bed. "My son is out there, and my wife went after him. I need to be with them." "Mr. Walker, you've suffered serious fractures. You can't simply—" "I'm signing the liability waiver. I can't stay here while my family is out there." In the forest, the two groups were approaching. The same destination by different paths. Rachel's Jeep was the first to stop when the improvised trail became too dense for the vehicle. "We'll have to continue on foot from here," she announced, grabbing backpacks equipped with flashlights, water, and first aid kits. Sarah got out of the vehicle, the amulet now practically burning in her hand. Suddenly she stopped, sensing a presence. A shiver ran down her spine, and instinctively she looked to the side. There, partially hidden among the shadows of the trees, was the mountain guardian. The imposing black horse observed the group, its bright eyes fixed on Sarah. "It's him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's the horse that took my son." The guardian whinnied softly, as if confirming her words, then turned, walking a few steps before stopping and looking back, clearly inviting them to follow. "He wants to show us the way," said Jack Wilson, with a serene smile. Rachel, who had reflexively raised her rifle, slowly lowered it. "This is impossible," she murmured. "The mountain has many impossibilities, young lady," replied the old man, "and we're about to discover more of them." A short distance away, Richard's truck also reached its limit. The men got out, equipped with powerful flashlights and weapons. The businessman held the amulet fragment tightly, his eyes following the glow emanating from it. "Spread out a bit but maintain visual contact," he ordered. "We're looking for a black horse, large, different from any other you've ever seen." The men nodded and began to move cautiously through the dense forest. The sound of the storm grew above them, but strangely, not a single drop of rain fell. It was as if the tempest was waiting, watching. Deep in the forest near the Oracle Stone, Noah seemed to sense his mother's approach. The baby, who had been calmly resting against the flank of one of the herd's horses, suddenly sat up, looking in the direction from which Sarah was coming. A smile lit up his round little face. The horses also perceived the change in the air. The entire herd became alert, some nervous, others expectant. The white stone pulsed with greater intensity, its glow gradually increasing, illuminating the hidden small canyon. Sarah's group followed the guardian along an invisible trail that seemed to appear as they advanced. The dense vegetation opened softly before them, as if inviting them into its secrets. "How is this possible?" murmured Rachel, astonished by what she was witnessing. "The same forest that can be impenetrable for some opens like a book for others," explained Jack Wilson. "It all depends on how you read it." Sarah barely heard the conversation. All her attention was on the black horse guiding them and the amulet in her hand, whose light now pulsed in perfect synchrony with the beats of her heart. Each step she took seemed to bring her not only physically closer to her son, but also to something deeper, an ancestral truth that had always been dormant within her. Mrs. Davis, walking beside her daughter, noticed the subtle change in her expression. "You're feeling it, aren't you?" she asked softly. "The connection." Sarah nodded without words to describe what she was experiencing. It was as if each tree, each stone, each breath of wind told a story she had always known but had forgotten. Not far away, Richard and his men were having a completely different experience. The forest seemed to resist their presence. Low branches blocked their path, hidden roots made them stumble, and the darkness grew denser with each step. "This doesn't make sense," grumbled Vince, after nearly falling for the third time. "It's as if the forest itself is against us." Richard didn't respond. His attention was completely focused on the amulet fragment, which now vibrated in his hand with painful intensity. A distant memory came to his mind. His grandfather, years before, telling of the night he almost captured the mountain guardian. How the animal had appeared in his dreams afterward, always calling him back to the mountain. "We're almost there," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. The two groups, following distinct paths dictated by the same ancestral power, were inexorably approaching the point of convergence where everyone's fate would be decided. At the center of this cosmic design, the oracle stone pulsed like a living heart, and beside it, a baby of just 1 year waited with a serenity that defied understanding. The mountain guardian stopped abruptly, raising its majestic head. Its ears moved, capturing sounds imperceptible to the humans following it. Something had changed in the forest atmosphere. "He's restless," observed Jack Wilson, approaching Sarah. "There are others in the woods tonight." Rachel, always alert, raised her rifle again, scanning the surrounding environment. "It might be my search teams," she suggested, though her tone indicated she didn't really believe this possibility. "No," replied the old man. "They are those who seek what doesn't belong to them." The black horse whinnied softly and resumed its pace, now more accelerated. The group followed with increasing difficulty, the vegetation becoming denser with each yard advanced. Sarah, however, seemed moved by a supernatural force. The amulet in her hand shone intensely, guiding her through the darkness. "We're close," she whispered. "I can feel Noah." At another point in the forest, Richard and his men finally found a clearing. The amulet fragment vibrated frantically in his hand, indicating they were on the right path. Vince, the most experienced of the trackers, knelt to examine the ground. "Horse tracks recent," he reported. "Many of them, actually. Looks like there's a whole herd around here." Richard felt a wave of excitement coursing through his body. After all these years, he was finally close to completing the mission his grandfather had begun. "Get ready," he ordered the men. "I want the black horse alive. As for the baby, he's just an accident in this story. Bring him too if you find him." The men exchanged doubtful glances, but no one dared question the orders. They continued advancing, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like sharp knives. Meanwhile, in the small town of Blue Ridge, Michael was leaving the hospital against medical recommendations. Dressed in an improvised manner and visibly weakened, he entered a taxi. "Where to, sir?" asked the driver, observing with concern the condition of his passenger. "To the entrance of the main mountain trail," replied Michael, breathing with difficulty. "And quickly, please." The driver hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, you look like you just got out of the hospital, and there's a storm forming." "That's exactly why I need to go," insisted Michael. "My family is up there." Reluctantly, the driver started the vehicle. In the forest, Sarah's group finally reached the limits of the small secret canyon. The mountain guardian stopped, turning to face them with its deep, intelligent eyes. "He wants us to continue alone from here," translated Jack Wilson. Rachel looked distrustfully at the animal and then at the path ahead. "How do you know that?" "The Ziwea." Old man smiled patiently. "Just as you read the signs of the forest, I read the signs of the guardian. It's an ancient language that few still understand." Sarah didn't wait for further explanations. Following the pulsating call of the amulet, she advanced through a narrow natural corridor formed between immense rocks. The others followed her cautiously. Emerging on the other side, the sight that greeted them left them breathless. A small valley hidden among the mountains, perfectly preserved, housed the oracle stone, an immense white rock formation that gleamed under the stormy sky as if it had its own light. Around it, about 20 wild horses formed a protective circle, and there, sitting calmly near the stone, was Noah. "My son," exclaimed Sarah, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. The baby looked in her direction, and his little face lit up with a smile of recognition. However, something unusual happened. Instead of crying or showing anxiety after days separated from his mother, Noah simply raised his small hand in a gesture that seemed like an invitation. Sarah instinctively moved forward, but was stopped by the mountain guardian, which appeared at her side, blocking her path. The black horse stared at her intensely, as if evaluating her intentions. "He's testing you," explained Jack Wilson. "The guardian protects the baby, but it also protects something greater, something that's beyond our understanding." At that moment, the amulet in Sarah's hand emitted such an intense glow that it illuminated the entire valley. The oracle stone responded with a similar pulse, creating a luminous dialogue between the two objects. Mrs. Davis gasped in surprise. The amulet never did this before, not even when Thomas carried it. "Because the time hadn't come," replied the old man. "The mountain waits sometimes for generations, until the right moment presents itself." Sarah, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, extended the amulet toward the guardian. The animal brought its muzzle close to the object, touching it delicately. An invisible current of energy seemed to pass between them, and the horse backed away, making way for her to advance to her son. With racing heart, Sarah walked to Noah and took him in her arms, embracing him with all the love and relief her heart could express. The baby laughed, happy in his mother's arms, but his eyes soon turned to the oracle stone, which continued to pulse. "What is this?" asked Sarah, more to herself than to others. "What's happening here?" Jack Wilson approached slowly, observing the stone with reverence. "They say the oracle stone holds the memories of the mountain. Everything that happened, everything that will happen. It chooses those who can hear it, those who can protect it. And it chose my son, a baby just 1 year old." "Innocence sees what eyes corrupted by greed cannot see," replied the old man. "Your son was chosen, just as your father was before him, and your grandfather before your father." At that moment, a strange noise cut through the air. The wild horses became agitated, nervous whinnies echoing through the valley. The guardian raised its head, alert to the approaching danger. Rachel, with her sharpened forest ranger senses, was the first to notice. "Someone's coming," she warned, raising her rifle. It wasn't long before Richard Hammond and his men emerged into the valley by another path. The businessman stopped, absorbing the scene before him with a mixture of astonishment and triumph. His eyes scanned Sarah's group, the wild horses, and finally fixed on the oracle stone. "We found it," he murmured, a smile forming on his lips. "After all this time, we finally found it." The broken fragment of the amulet in his hand glowed with the same intensity as the complete amulet that Sarah held. The two objects seemed to recognize each other, calling to one another across the space that separated their bearers. "You shouldn't be here," said Rachel, pointing her rifle in the direction of the intruders. "This area is restricted." Richard laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Restricted? This place doesn't even exist on your maps, Forest Ranger. Nobody knows it exists, except those who have been called." His eyes met Sarah's and then shifted to the baby in her arms. "So it's true," he continued. "The mountain guardian really did save the baby. Interesting. My grandfather spoke of an ancient prophecy about a child who would be protected by the black horse. He believed this meant the oracle stone would finally reveal its secrets." "What's your interest in all this?" asked Sarah, protectively clutching Noah against her chest. Richard raised the broken fragment of the amulet. "I see you have the other part. Together they form the key to the mountain's greatest treasure, the knowledge my grandfather spent his entire life seeking." The storm above them intensified. Lightning now cut across the sky with greater frequency, creating a spectacle of light and shadow over the secret valley. The oracle stone pulsed in synchrony with the thunder, as if responding to the growing violence of the elements. The tension in the valley was palpable. On one side, Sarah, with Noah firmly secured in her arms, protected by her mother, Jack Wilson and Rachel. On the other, Richard Hammond and his 3 armed men, with determined expressions and calculating gazes. Between the 2 groups, the Mountain Guardian remained motionless, its attentive eyes alternating between the humans, as if evaluating each of them. "There is no treasure here," said Jack Wilson, stepping forward. "The mountain doesn't guard gold or precious stones. What it protects goes far beyond the understanding of men driven by greed." Richard smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Greed? You call the desire to know secrets guarded for generations greed? My grandfather dedicated his life to this." He raised the amulet fragment again. "This piece was all that remained when he disappeared in these mountains, and now, finally, I've found the missing piece." His eyes fixed on the complete amulet that Sarah held. "Give me the amulet and no one gets hurt," he ordered, gesturing for his men to ready their weapons. Rachel immediately positioned herself in front of Sarah and Noah. "Lower your weapons. Now," she commanded with the authority of a forest ranger. "You're committing several crimes at this moment." One of Richard's men, Vince, gave a short laugh. "And who's going to stop us, you alone against the 4 of us?" The Mountain Guardian whinnied, loud and powerful, making the ground tremble slightly beneath its hooves. The other wild horses responded to the call, forming a defensive line around Sarah's group. "I don't think she's alone," observed Jack Wilson with a calm smile. Richard made an impatient gesture, pointing to the animals. "They're just horses. Scare them off if necessary." 1. Dove his men drew a weapon, aiming it at the Guardian. The black horse didn't back down, its eyes fixed on the man, showing no fear. "No," shouted Sarah. "Don't do that." Noah, as if sensing the danger, began to cry. It was a sound different from any normal baby cry, higher-pitched, more desperate. The instant his tears touched Sarah's skin, something unusual happened. The amulet in her hand and the oracle stone simultaneously emitted a flash of light so intense that it momentarily blinded everyone present. When vision returned, the oracle stone had changed. Its surface, previously smooth, now displayed ancient engravings, symbols, and drawings that told a story. "The stone has awakened," murmured Jack Wilson, amazed. "After so many years, it's finally revealing its secrets." Images began to form on the stone's surface, like a living projection. They showed the mountains in ancient times, when indigenous peoples inhabited the region. They showed the Mountain Guardian, even then protector of those lands, and the first humans chosen to carry the amulet, human guardians who would work in partnership with the mystical horse to preserve the balance of nature. "This is what your grandfather sought, Hammond," explained Jack Wilson. "Not a treasure of gold or diamonds, but knowledge, the true history of these lands, the secret of coexistence between humans and nature." Richard didn't seem convinced. His eyes eagerly scanned the images on the stone, looking for something specific. "My grandfather spoke of a power," he insisted, "a power that would allow control over the elements, to shape the earth itself." Jack Wilson sadly shook his head. "Your grandfather understood everything wrong. The amulet doesn't grant power over the earth, but responsibility toward it. The human guardians don't control nature. They protect it, learn from it, become part of it." The storm above them intensified. Thunder echoed among the mountains, and lightning illuminated the sky with greater frequency. However, not a single drop of rain fell, as if the sky itself was waiting for the outcome of that confrontation. "Enough talk," Richard became irritated. "Vince, take the amulet from her." The man advanced, determined, but the Mountain Guardian intervened, positioning itself between him and Sarah. The man hesitated, looking to Richard for instructions. "Don't be ridiculous," mocked the businessman. "It's just a horse." At that moment, a noise drew everyone's attention. Someone was approaching, staggering and breathless. It was Michael, pale and visibly weakened, but with determination stamped on his face. "Sarah! Noah!" he called before falling to his knees, exhausted from the climb. "Michael!" Sarah ran to her husband, still with Noah in her arms. "How did you get here?" "I followed the call," he replied with difficulty. "I dreamed of this place, of the black horse. I knew I needed to be here." Richard observed the scene with growing impatience. Michael's arrival had momentarily diverted everyone's attention, giving him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. In a quick movement, he advanced toward Sarah, trying to snatch the amulet from her hand. What happened next was so fast that no one could completely process it. The mountain guardian whinnied, a sound that seemed to tear the air itself. The oracle stone emitted an even more intense pulse of light, and all the wild horses reacted in unison, forming a perfect circle around the stone, the guardian, and Sarah's family. Richard, who had managed to touch the amulet, was repelled by an invisible force. He fell backward, dazed, the broken fragment escaping his fingers and rolling across the valley floor. "What's happening?" shouted one of the men, now visibly frightened. The answer came in the form of an impressive phenomenon. The broken fragment of the amulet that Richard had carried began to move on its own, sliding across the ground until it stopped near the complete amulet that Sarah held. The two objects emitted an intense glow, as if they were communicating. Jack Wilson observed everything with wondering eyes. The broken amulet was never a separate key, he explained. It was part of the original amulet, broken generations ago when your grandfather tried to use it for selfish purposes. Sarah, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain, bent down and picked up the broken fragment, bringing it close to the complete amulet. The two pieces fit together perfectly, and a golden light emanated from the cracks as if the metal was fusing, healing. "No!" shouted Richard, advancing again. "That belongs to me. It's mine by right." This time it was Rachel who stopped him, firmly positioning herself in his path. "The only right you have now is the right to remain silent," she said with authority. "Trespassing on protected land, threatening with a firearm, attempted assault. The list just keeps growing, Hammond." The businessman backed away, frustrated, while his men exchanged nervous glances, clearly reassessing their options. Sarah, still holding Noah with one arm, raised the now restored amulet. The piece shone intensely, pulsing in the same rhythm as the oracle stone. The connection between the two objects was evident, as if they were parts of the same being, separated only by physical distance. The restored amulet pulsed in Sarah's hands like a living heart. Its golden glow illuminated the entire valley, reflecting in the attentive eyes of the wild horses that maintained their protective circle. Noah, in his mother's arms, extended his little hands toward the gleaming object, as if recognizing its importance. "What should I do now?" asked Sarah, looking at Jack Wilson. The old countryman smiled serenely. "It's not for me to say, my child. The amulet chose you just as the guardian chose your son. The decision is yours." Michael, still weak but now supported by Mrs. Davis, observed the scene with a mixture of fascination and concern. "Sarah," he called, softly, "trust your instinct. We always have." The storm above them reached its apex. Lightning crossed the sky in complex patterns, like an ancient language encoded in light. The wind blew in circles inside the valley, creating a whirlwind of leaves around the oracle stone, but without touching those present. Richard Hammond, momentarily contained by Rachel and his increasingly hesitant men, observed everything with eyes burning with ambition and frustration. "You don't understand the power you're holding," he shouted to Sarah. "Think of what we could do together. Shape nature, control the elements. We would be like gods." Jack Wilson sadly shook his head. "That same ambition destroyed your grandfather, young man. He also believed the amulet would grant unlimited power, when in fact its purpose was always something else." "And what would that purpose be?" asked Rachel, still maintaining a vigilant posture but clearly curious about the unfolding events. It was Sarah who answered, her voice calm and sure, as if the words came not from her thoughts, but from some newly awakened ancestral knowledge. "Balance," she said, looking at the amulet in her hand. "The amulet doesn't grant power over nature, but the ability to hear it, to understand its rhythms, to live in harmony with it." As she spoke, the images on the oracle stone changed, now showing a sequence of human guardians throughout the centuries, each carrying the amulet, each working in communion with the mountain guardian to protect the mountains and their secrets. "My father was one of them," continued Sarah, recognizing the figure of Thomas, Sarah's father, and Mrs. Davis's husband among the images projected on the stone. "And before him, my grandfather, a lineage of guardians that was lost when my father..." She hesitated, searching for the right words. Left us. Mrs. Davis wiped away a tear. Thomas never told everything. He said the less we knew, the more protected we would be, but he always returned to the mountains, spent days here. He said he was taking care of the land. The mountain guardian approached Sarah, its deep eyes fixed on hers. The animal inclined its majestic head as if in a gesture of reverence. It recognizes you as the legitimate guardian, explained Jack Wilson. Just as it recognized Noah as the future guardian, the horse always knows, always chooses those whose hearts are in tune with the mountain. Richard, unable to contain himself, made a sudden movement, trying to free himself from Rachel. This is madness. You're all blinded by mysticism. The amulet and the stone are clearly advanced technological artifacts, perhaps alien, perhaps from some ancient civilization. We can study them, replicate them, use them to revolutionize the world. His men exchanged increasingly uncomfortable glances. The situation had escalated far beyond what they expected when they accepted the job. Boss, said Vince, lowering his weapon, I think we're out of our depth here. The other two men followed his example, slowly backing away. Cowards, vociferated Richard. Don't you see the opportunity before you? Sarah stepped forward, still holding Noah and the restored amulet. What I see is a man consumed by the same obsession that destroyed his grandfather, she said firmly. The mountain is not a resource to be exploited, Hammond. It's a home, a sanctuary, a legacy we must protect for future generations. As she spoke, she approached the oracle stone. When she got close enough, she raised the amulet toward the engraved surface of the rock. The metal object and the stone pulsed in perfect synchrony, as if communicating in a silent ancient language. Then something extraordinary happened. A small cavity, perfectly molded for the amulet, revealed itself on the surface of the oracle stone. Sarah, following her instinct, fit the object into the corresponding space. The effect was immediate and spectacular. A wave of golden light emanated from the stone, expanding in concentric circles throughout the valley. Each plant, each leaf, each blade of grass seemed to absorb that energy, gaining renewed vitality. The wild horses whinnied in unison, as if in celebration. Noah laughed, clapping his hands, as if perfectly understanding the meaning of that moment. What's happening? Asked Michael, amazed. The renewal, replied Jack Wilson. Each generation, when a new guardian assumes their role, the mountain renews its strength, its balance. Richard observed everything with a mixture of anger and fascination. His plan had crumbled, but the vision before him was undeniably extraordinary. You still don't understand, do you? Asked Sarah, turning to him. It's not about power, Hammond. It's about responsibility, about care, about coexistence. At that moment, the storm above them began to dissipate. The dark clouds slowly parted, allowing the first rays of the rising sun to penetrate the valley. The rain, which had been contained throughout the night, finally fell, a soft, warm drizzle that seemed to bless the land and all those present. The mountain guardian approached Sarah and Noah again. The black horse lowered its head, allowing the baby to touch its muzzle. The connection between them was palpable, as if they shared a secret that transcended words. That's it, understood Mrs. Davis, observing the scene with tears in her eyes. The choice has been made. The lineage continues. Rachel, who still kept Richard under control, seemed to have difficulty processing everything she was witnessing. So, what happens now? She asked. Now, replied Jack Wilson. The mountain. I was safe for another generation. The balance has been restored. Sarah looked at the amulet fitted into the stone. Surprisingly, she felt no desire to remove it. Somehow she knew it belonged in that place, that its function was to serve as a bridge between the human world and the natural world. Come, she finally said, turning to her family. Let's go home. Michael smiled, extending his hand to his wife and son. Mrs. Davis and Jack Wilson followed them, while Rachel escorted a defeated Richard Hammond back to the trail. The hired men had disappeared, preferring not to wait to face the legal consequences of their actions. The mountain guardian observed the group move away. When Sarah looked back one last time, the imposing black horse was still there, silhouetted against the light of dawn, its intelligent eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom and a renewed commitment. Weeks later, life in Blue Ridge had returned to an apparent normality. Richard Hammond faced judicial proceedings for various environmental crimes and trespassing. His plans for the luxury resort had been abandoned, and the company announced its withdrawal from the region. Sarah, Michael, and Noah moved permanently to the small town, settling in the house that had belonged to her parents. Sarah continued her work as a pediatrician at the local hospital, while Michael documented the beauty of the mountains through his photographs, now with an even more sensitive eye for the details and mysteries of nature. As for Noah, he grew, strong and healthy, demonstrating from an early age an unusual connection with the natural world. Often, Sarah would find him in the backyard, conversing in his baby language with birds that confidently perched on his small shoulders. And on full moon nights, it wasn't uncommon for residents of farms near the mountains to report sightings of a majestic black horse, observing from afar the house where the future guardian slept peacefully, protected by the love of his parents and the ancestral strength of a land that had chosen his family as protectors of its most precious secrets. The Oracle Stone. The amulet remained fitted, pulsing in synchrony with the heart of the mountain, keeping alive the balance between worlds and ensuring that, as long as there were guardians willing to listen to nature's voice, harmony would prevail over greed and destruction. And so in the mountains of Virginia, where the morning mist hides so many mysteries, the legend of the mountain guardian lived on, whispered from generation to generation, a constant reminder that true treasures are not those we can possess, but those that possess us, transform us and connect us to the eternal and sacred rhythm of life.